Thanks very much, Deb. Before I start, I just want to have a little warning about this talk, and that is that sometimes hearing about compassion fatigue can be a bit distressing. So if it is, and if there's concerns raised, there's my email address. Please feel free to contact me if you want to, and I'll be around for a little time afterwards. So make me available to you. Okay, let me quickly cover what I'm. Yes, sorry. Gary F2310@gmail.com. You're welcome. Briefly what I'll cover. I'll give an introduction to compassion fatigue, and then I'll talk about what are the things that cause it or contribute to it. And in that I'll be talking about vicarious traumatisation and burnout. Then I'll talk about compassion fatigue at some more length and talk about the things that can be done to modify it, to prevent it, and to manage it. And then hopefully I'll have enough time to give a little bit of an exercise on a technique of one of the ways of self-care. So, let me start off with a quote from Charles Figley, a guy that's done a lot of work in this area. All of us who attempt to heal the wounds of others will ourselves be wounded. It is, after all, inherent in the relationship. Compassion fatigue is an occupational hazard, particularly when you work with people who are suffering and are traumatised by it. And another quote from Remen: the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. This stuff rubs off on us. And finally, Charles Figley: we have not been directly exposed to the trauma scene, but we hear the story told with such intensity, or we hear similar stories so often, or we have the gift and curse of extreme empathy and we suffer. We feel the feelings of our clients, we experience their fears, we dream their dreams. Eventually, we lose a spark of optimism, humour and hope. We tire. We aren't sick, but we aren't ourselves. It's a very good definition of compassion fatigue. So how does this develop? Well, one of the significant factors in this is secondary traumatic stress. And this introduces the notion of vicarious trauma. And these are harmful changes in our views of ourselves, of others, and of the world as a result of exposure to the graphic or traumatic material of our clients. It changes us. And secondary traumatic stress is a set of psychological symptoms that mimic post-traumatic stress disorder. But it is acquired through exposure to other people who are suffering the effects of trauma. We don't necessarily be traumatised ourselves directly. These are the symptoms of secondary traumatic stress: being anxious, being overreactive, having a heightened threat perception, having problems sleeping, lack of concentration, physical problems of various kinds, intrusive thoughts, and work beginning to interfere with our personal lives. Feeling inadequate, avoiding people, places, things, reminders, even patients. Loss of energy, gratification and hope. Separation, from our colleagues, from sometimes our patients, sometimes our partners, and sometimes ourselves. And use of self-medication, both prescribed and otherwise. What are the contributors to developing secondary traumatic stress? Well, past traumatic experience in our own lives. People that have been exposed to trauma are susceptible to trauma. Having images of what's going on or seeing images of people suffering. Having high empathy. Empathy is a risk for developing secondary traumatic stress. Being worried about the safety of the people that we work with makes us more at risk. Working with children or working in situations which involve children heightens our risk. The nature of the work we do and the nature of the setting in which we work. So settings that are not particularly helpful, empathic or well-resourced are a problem. Personal issues, if we have any of our own personal problems, psychological or psychosocial stress issues, they heighten our risk for secondary traumatic stress. And being new, so coming into the field, in this case of motor neuron disease, as a first, like having not worked in the field before, that increases our susceptibility to developing secondary traumatic stress. I've mentioned that it mimics post-traumatic stress disorder. Let's have a look at how it's similar to it. People with secondary traumatic stress have intrusion into their thinking about the people and the issues of the people with whom they work. So this would be dreams, nightmares, just intrusive thoughts, not being able to get people out of your head. And when those intrusive thoughts come, there's hyperarousal. That's psychophysiological symptoms. Blood pressure going up, getting a bit nauseous, a bit sweaty, heart rate a little raised, that kind of stuff. And avoiding reminders of your work, avoiding people that you work with, sometimes avoiding feelings because it's easier to feel nothing than it is to feel the distress. What are the differences between secondary traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder? People who develop post-traumatic stress disorder experience a trauma. People who develop secondary traumatic stress hear about it. They listen to the stories of people who are suffering. People who develop post-traumatic stress disorder, work doesn't affect their personal lives. But if you've got secondary traumatic stress, your work starts to affect your personal life. The level of distress and impairment is worse in post-traumatic stress disorder. So there's similarities and differences that mimic and separate these conditions. So how come trauma is relevant in this field? Well, I come from working in multiple sclerosis. And before 2004, there was nothing in the literature about people with MS being traumatised. I've been working in the field of trauma in all my career, and when I started to work with people with MS, I realised I was hearing trauma language, and so we did a study. We found that 60% of people with multiple sclerosis have trauma reactions. We call it partial post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's because there's three cardinal features of PTSD. There's re-experience. People with MS have re-experienced dreams, nightmares, flashbacks, intrusive thoughts every day. Hyperarousal, getting that psychophysiological arousal stuff, blood pressure going up, heart rate racing, etc. and so forth, every day whenever they have the re-experience. And then there's avoidance, but people with MS can't avoid. They've got to take their medication every day or every couple of days. They have symptoms every day. There's always something that stops them from being able to avoid their condition. Therefore, one of the cardinal features they can't score. That's why they have partial post-traumatic stress disorder, but they still have a stress disorder. And rather than avoiding, they often experience high levels of anger, which is a problem, particularly in relationships, and a great deal of guilt. These are all anxiety disorders. Post-traumatic stress disorder is classified as anxiety disorder. And guilt is anxiety. Guilt is worrying that you should have done something that you didn't do, or that you didn't do something that you should have done. And a lot of people with their condition end up feeling guilty that they did something they shouldn't have done, or they didn't do something that they should have done. And when people work with clients with MS, what they experience is within each patient repeated displays of distress, and within all their patients repeated displays of distress. So they're being vicariously exposed to this stuff every day, every work day. I gave a real good search on the literature. I could find nothing about trauma in MND. But I suspect that's only because no one's actually asked the question. Louise, that was in the video a little earlier, she was traumatised by getting the diagnosis. She actually said it, but she hides it very, very well. What we do know is that there's high rates of depression in MND, and depression is a strong correlate of trauma, and psychophysiologically or psychoneuroimmunologically, it actually feeds into a lot of the condition. But what staff who work with people with MND see in each one of their clients is repeated high levels of distress, and in all their clients, repeated high levels of distress. So there's lots of exposure developing potentially secondary or vicarious trauma. So that's secondary traumatic stress. That leads us to burnout. Organisations under pressure are organisations where burnout is potentially a problem. And organisations under pressure are those with too much work that's increasing and not enough resources that are decreasing. And that almost describes every non-government organisation and charity organisation. And so management starts to be under pressure, and they start to look at what goals that they have to achieve, which is about seeing more people. So they stop worrying about the quality of the work, they just start worrying about the quantity of the work. And if you're not worried about the quality of the work, then you're not appreciating the quality of the work that your staff do, and so you don't give them any appreciation. And under these conditions, staff start to feel that there's more and more being asked for with less and less resource, and what they do isn't appreciated, and that management keeps making these stupid decisions that are based on bureaucratic numbers rather than clinical care. These are the conditions that can lead to burnout. This is a process, and it gradually worsens over time as organisations struggle under pressure. And it's a gradual process that's due to exposure to this work stress and tension. And gradually there's an attrition of optimism and of the ideals that you had when you began working in the field, and a sense of lack of success and accomplishment. That results in exhaustion, isolation, and a sense of decreased effectiveness. And burnout and secondary traumatic stress are often co-travellers. Burnout is work-related hopelessness and feelings of inefficacy. Secondary traumatic stress is work-related. It's about secondary exposure to extremely or traumatically stressful events. And both share very negative affect or emotion. Burnout is about being worn out. Secondary traumatic stress is about being afraid. And that leads us to compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is always a possibility amongst those who care for others. It's an occupational hazard. Interestingly, there's no compassion fatigue when you're caring, all your caring is successful. And another key point is that if you don't care for yourself working in these fields, physically, emotionally, spiritually, then eventually there'll be not enough left of you to care for anyone else. And if you don't care for yourself, no one else will. Compassion fatigue is not a character flaw. Compassion fatigue is an occupational hazard. So, secondary traumatisation plus burnout equals compassion fatigue. It's a combination of those two conditions that can develop when working in these fields of care and assistance and support. It's a state of tension, and it describes the emotional, physical, social and spiritual exhaustion that overtakes a person and causes a pervasive decline in his or her desire, ability and energy to feel and care for others. It's an occupational hazard. So how do we develop this? Well, there's a whole lot of misconceptions that people who work caring for others develop. The first and worst is, I will fix the problem. I'll make everything okay, I'll save the world. That's just not true. I'm responsible for the outcomes. And often this can translate into I'm solely responsible for the outcomes. That's not true. If I care enough, everything will be okay. That's not true. The person with the problem, the victim, the sufferer, will appreciate everything I do for them. You all know that's not true. I will have enough resources, enough time, enough money, enough material, skills, training to be able to fix things. There's never enough. And the significant people in my life will support and approve of my absence from our relationship while I get on working with this compassionate mission. That's not true. I know what I'm getting into. If you remember back to when the first couple of weeks when you started to work in this field of motor neurone disease, I'm sure that you can all remember in those first few weeks a moment when you thought, what the hell have I got myself into? So that's not true. I can do it alone. That's most definitely not true. If I'm spiritual enough, I can deal with the stress of working with suffering people. That's not true. And I have a definition of success, and it is, I can save the world, I can fix everything, I can be a saving angel. Wish that were true, but we've got to be very, very careful about how we describe or define our success. So let's try to rewrite some of those misconceptions. What you are responsible for is your tasks. The outcomes you're not responsible for. You're responsible for doing your tasks. If you're of a religious persuasion, let God be responsible for the outcomes. If you're more secular, then let your client and those others that support them be responsible for the outcomes. What you're responsible for is your job, the tasks. You are not God. You can't fix the world. You can't save everyone. You can't reduce suffering in people that suffer. The need will always be greater than the resources. Be careful how you measure success. Success is getting your tasks done, not curing people, not making the suffering go away. That's beyond you. Value your small victories. Value the fact that you've got your tasks done and pat yourself on the back. No one else will. Who you are is as important to the mission as what you do. So it's not all task-oriented. The person that you are brings a lot of power into the help that you give. Although it's terrible to see clients in pain and you have great empathy for them, the client's pain is not your pain. So don't carry it. Don't take your clients home with you in any form. Don't take them home physically. Don't take them home emotionally, in your head or your heart. Remember to care for yourself, your spirit, your emotions and your body, so that there'll be something left to give. A lot of people think this idea of taking care of yourself is selfish. But the thing is that if you look after yourself well enough, you are available to help others. If you don't, you're not available. So quickly, what are the work organisational factors? One is working in an organisation that has low empathy for staff. That's a risk factor from work. Organisations that don't do enough training or don't value training and don't value experience. They're risk organisations. Working in a situation where there's an increased frequency of exposure to trauma or suffering material. We know you all are at risk there. Caring for the most vulnerable is a risk. Risk here. Working in organisations that don't allow enough recovery time after being exposed to those conditions. Recovery time is very important. Organisations where there's low quality supervision or there's not enough supervision. That increases risk. Organisations in which people can work in isolated ways or there's fragmentation within the system and the services. And organisations where there's low resource and it's systemic. So that's what compassion fatigue is about. That's how it kind of gets developed. Are there ways to get over it, to do something about it, to stop it happening? Well, thankfully, the answer is pretty much yes, but it's about you caring for yourself. You've got to take care of yourself physically. It's important to get enough sleep, to get enough rest, and to get enough respite. You've got to be able to get away from the stress that you're exposed to. So your weekend should be off. You should take holidays. You should take respite between clients, etc. and so forth. You need to eat well, get good nutrition. You need to get exercise. 30 minutes of heart pumping exercise 3 to 4 times a week minimum. You need to look after yourself and get regular medical, dental, psychological checkups so you're well. You've got to take care of yourself in the workplace. Maintain a work-life balance. It's really important. It's easy to say, but it's hard to do. Learn to delegate. It's really important to be able to say no. And if you are overloaded, if you're stressed, ask for help. And that's not just at work, it's also at home. You need to come up with a strategy from being able to transition from being at work and overloaded and being at home. There needs to be something that separates those. You need to get regular supervision of good quality, people that know their stuff and can help, and you need to get that regularly. You need to make sure that you're working at your level of competence. When there's big need and high demand, we're tempted to work, to try to do more than we're actually trained to do. You'll only have failure experiences, and that's not a good idea. Yes, get yourself more trained, develop your skills, absolutely, but work at your level of competence. And if you are struggling, you might need to reduce your hours. And that's quite acceptable, as long as you can afford it. You need to take care of yourself psychologically and emotionally. If you have past or present traumas, get personal therapy and resolve them. Otherwise, you continue to remain at risk. Be aware of the signs of burnout, secondary trauma, compassion fatigue. I've given you a bit of a checklist today. If any of you are thinking, oh yeah, that's me, that's me, that's me, act. Get some help, get some support. Try to reduce your negative self-talk. It's very easy in this kind of work to be hard on ourselves. Be aware of your positive characteristics, be aware of your achievements, even the little ones. Reward yourself, pat yourself on the back for all the positive things that you do. Reduce your trauma inputs. When you're working with people that are traumatised and highly stressed and suffering, you don't need to go home and watch it on television. Reduce the exposure. Make sure you get supervision. Make sure you get support, and make sure you debrief. In between those difficult sessions you have with your clients, make sure you debrief. And I've heard a number of talks today saying that there is opportunity for debriefing, and that's fantastic. That is really very positive. And the fact that you use it, very good. Socialise. Make sure that you mix with people and you stay connected, because isolation is a problem in this compassion fatigue. And exercise your laugh muscles. I've heard that a few times today, and that's really very good. See the humour in things and laugh out loud. It's very good for the soul. You also need to take care spiritually and existentially. Some people, and this is about making meaning, and I've heard that mentioned a couple of times today as well. Some people find writing things down to get it out of their head and their heart is helpful. So journaling is one skill. Develop a spiritual, existential life. If you're religious, use prayer. Otherwise, mindfulness, be mindful, use meditation, relaxation, use breathing exercises, take up yoga, martial arts. Martial arts is fantastic for relieving secondary trauma stress. Take up music, take up singing, join a choir. Singing is very, very good for the soul. Sing in the shower. Okay, and just in terms of how to look after yourself and self-care, I want to give you a little exercise. So I'm going to walk away from the microphone. I'm sure you can all hear me, because I want you to put your hands on your stomach. Now, it's very good that I have a stomach that actually is big enough for you to be able to see what goes on. Yeah, absolutely, go ahead. What I'd like you to do is take a deep breath in. Okay, just having a look around, this is what most of you did. So that provides nice oxygen up here, which is very good. It keeps you alive. To be able to de-arouse, kind of self-soothe, you want to take a deep breath in down here. So the breath should look like this. I'll turn sideways. The air's down here, okay? And this is how you should breathe in. In and out. Now that's about an 8-second cycle. Most people can't do more than about 3 seconds, and that's fine. What I want you to do is keep your hands on your stomach, and I want you to breathe in, take 3 seconds to breathe in, and then 3 seconds to breathe out, making sure the air is down here. Close your eyes if you want to. Just take 3 breaths in and out. Okay. Who feels a little calmer than when I first started to talk? That 3 breaths in for 3 seconds and out for 3 seconds, that's only 3 breaths at 6 seconds each. It's less than 20 seconds and you feel calmer. Do that every time you put the phone down from one of those calls. You've got 20 seconds. That's all it takes. And this is a very simple skill that we can all use several times a day just to take the edge off. Because over a day, your stress levels go up like that. You can knock it off every half hour in 20 seconds. That's it. Thank you.